Hello, fellow pushers. Welcome to Pushing Cardboard. I'm Grant Lindenberg, and this is episode 27. Happy New Year, David Thompson. Today we're going to take a look back at last year, look at some lists and polls, and maybe look at what 2024 holds for us. And then my interview with the amazing David Thompson, co-designer of the Undaunted series, as well as a ton of other great games and series. And we'll have news, new games, what's on my table, and all the other usual things a cardboard pusher pushes. Last episode went over well with many folks commenting on the Kevin Bertram interview. Yes, he is just as nice a guy as you imagined. And again this year, he recently posted his financials for Fort Circle on his blog, so for those of you wanting to know some real numbers about publishing games, he's your man. News. Well, lots going on in the hobby around here. Last week, I was back at the Armchair Dragoons online convention, ACDC. I interviewed Volko Runke, where he debuted his new World War II game, Coast Watchers. We really dove into the history of the Coast Watchers in the Pacific Theater, and then demoed the game and showed off many of its mechanics. I'll put a link in the notes and newsletter, as the video and the interview is now up on my YouTube channel. Actually, I'll try to have links for most of the things in that I talk about in this section on the notes and on the newsletter that most of you will be receiving. And as a nice follow-up to that, I'll be doing something similar for Winter Quarters, the San Diego HistCon online convention in February. It runs the weekend of the 2nd to the 4th. I'll be interviewing Mike Ranella. As longtime listeners know, I'm a big fan of Area Impulse games, and Mike is the current champ of Area Impulse designs. We'll talk about all those as well as his new popular solitaire designs. It's just $10 to register for the whole weekend, so please come by and listen and maybe fire a question or two of your own my way. Or Mike's way, more to the point. Speaking of Mike Ranella, one of my favorite games by him, Stalingrad Verdun on the Volga, has long been out of print, but Mike's reached a deal with ATO magazine where it will be reprinted as a magazine game. Rules and maps are the same, but maybe a few new counters and scenarios. The only real difference is it'll come in the magazine rather than in the box where it previously came. And it was a fairly expensive game before. I think it was about $100 US. So now you're going to get it at whatever the price of an ATO. I think it's going to come out in one of their annual packages. So look for that. There'll be a link again for that. I think their Kickstarter or whatever they're calling it just finished, but they are taking late pledges. So you can still get in on the introductory pricing for that. We had another Pushing Cardboard member win a game for entering our last survey after last episode. Congratulations to David Wilson. A copy of Tank on Tank Westfront has your name on it. I'll be sending that out to you as soon as I receive your mailing address details. On the Pushing Cardboard website, I've also converted my podcast piece on Task Force from VUCA Games into a web piece. So check it out if you'd like to see some photos of the game to go along with what you heard on the podcast. From GMT, some of the more interesting news is that siblings Rachel and Luke Billingsley have started a video podcast about all things GMT. 2 episodes are out now. It looks pretty good. The first one they interviewed Harold Buchanan, and the second one I think they talked with Herman Luttman. I'm going to be out of a job if these publishers get good at this. Anyway, good to see. Operational Study Groups has a new game, Napoleon's End. It's the Campaign in France, Part 3, February and March 1814. I think it's still available to be pre-ordered, so check out their website if you're interested in that. Back at GMT, in their December update, they announced a few new reprints to popular titles such as Normandy 44, Atlantic Chase, and Simple GBOH. As well, there's a new mission pack for Combat Commander Pacific and a new game by Mark Herman and David Doctor about the first weeks of the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then in the January update, they announced a few games that are shipping. Of particular interest to me was Panzer North Africa, as I've never tried that, as well as reprints of Commands and Colors Medieval and Commands and Colors Napoleon Epic. There's also a link to a free micro scenario for Men of Iron thanks to Peter Moses. Sorry about mangling your name there, Peter. New on the P500 list is another musket and pike dual pack that includes remakes of Under the Lily Banners and Gustav Adolf the Great. And At Any Cost Metz is getting a reprint. I think this is interesting as this was one of Herman Luttmann's first designs where he invented his blind sword system. And with the way blind swords, American Civil War games have been selling for Revolution games, it makes perfect sense that there's a demand to see this game back in print. They've also announced Herman's Plum Island horror game on P500. So if that's your jam, have at it. I've heard it's an excellent game. Revolution has 3 new games on pre-order as well, and a reprint. The reprint is Mike Ranella's solo game Stalingrad Advance on the Volga. That sold so well they're reprinting it and now have a new solo game from Mike, Manila, The Savage Streets 1945. I think Mike's got a whole bunch of planned titles for that series. I wish him well with these, but I sure hope he doesn't quit doing 2-player games, as I'm a big fan of his 2-player games. As well from Revolution, there's 2 new Blind Swords games on the way. Prelude to Vicksburg, Chickasaw Bayou, December 26 to 29th, 1862, and Sedgwick Attacks, Salem Church, May 3rd, 1863. These are volume 9 and 10 of the popular Blind Swords series. I'm definitely looking forward to both of those. What's on the table? Well, away from all the PBEM things I do, on the table at home this month, I've been soloing 2 different games on Gazala, the World War II North African battle. First, Gazala, the Cauldron from Roger Miller and Revolution Games. It uses the same chit pull and event chit setup as their popular Cells game. Really smooth, easy to get up and going. I really like Cells, and I played this one a little bit before, but I'm having a much more thorough go with it this time and really enjoying it. And then I've started with Operation Theseus, Gazala 1942 from VUCA. It's a fair bit more detailed than the Revolution game, and also a fair bit more fiddly. But I'm still enjoying it. They both have much to recommend them. I think maybe a side-by-side look might make it into a future podcast if all goes well. I also played a scenario from Norman Conquest, the latest Men of Iron game. I'm going to definitely dig into this farther and feature it on a future podcast or a video. I'm really starting to like this system. New games to the collection. From Phalanx, I got a copy of Iron, Blood, Snow, and Mud. I haven't really done anything with it yet, but I look forward to playing that. I hear good things about it. I got a few things that they're all new, but they were secondhand to me. Some stuff for ASL. From Le Franc Tireur, I got their volume 14 on the Italians, and also from the Cellar, pack 9, a group of just a scenario pack. And then from Bounding Fire, I got Operation Neptune, which is a complete historical ASL game. So it'll be a while before I get to that, but it looks very interesting. From the Hollandaise sale from Hollandspiel, I got 3 things. I got District Commander Bien Din from Vietnam, 1969. Brian Train's game, part of his District Commander series. I got More Aggressive Attitudes, the 1862 Virginia campaign. I wanted to try something from this series from Hollandspiel for a while, so this is my first one. And then I got another update, or another expansion for Table Battles. I got the English Civil War expansion. So I look forward to trying that. Especially exciting as Table Battles is one of the games that is now showed up on Rally the Troops. So I'm playing 3 games right now on Rally the Troops of Table Battles and enjoying it all. As I mentioned earlier, I've got my copy of Norman Conquest, Men of Iron Volume 5. I'm definitely going to dig into that sooner rather than later. On a game trade, a friend of mine sent me a copy of Battles magazine, the issue with War of Tanks, France, 1914, the breakthrough at Dinant. So I'd always heard really great things about that particular issue. I mean, I loved Battles magazine, and I'm really sad that it's no longer around. But I'm glad to get my hands on that. And then finally, and this was a weird one, I finally received my copy of Axis Empire's Ultimate Edition. I'd ordered it way back when everybody else did, and it didn't come. But I thought, sometimes things take a while to come from the States. often the template is they tell you wait 4 to 6 weeks, but usually things come in 2 to 3 weeks. But here it was 10 weeks and it still hadn't come. So I contacted Decision and said, hey, I ordered this and I paid for it. Whatever happened to it? And they told me they shipped it out on November 9th, and I should check with my post office and find out if they have it. And because they said they checked with their post office and they said the tracking number had expired, which seemed very weird that tracking numbers could expire. Anyway, I checked with my post office. They didn't have it. They said they wouldn't even have a tracking number if it never made it to Canada. So I went back to Decision and they said, well, they'd put in a claim with the post office and in the meantime, they'd send me out a new game and all was well. And then 2 days later, it showed up at my post office. It had a sticker saying it had been mailed on November 9th, and then a sticker from Canada Customs saying it had been received at Canada Customs on January 10th, and then another sticker saying it had been mailed to me on January 14th. So somehow it took from November 9th to January 10th for it to get from the USPS to Canada Customs. So who knew where it got lost? Anyway, I got a hold of Decision right away and said, hey, don't send me another one that out of the blue, the one that we were just worried about finally showed up. So anyway, that's a game I'm very interested in getting a look at. It I've opened it up and looked through it. It's a giant package. It's heavy. It's got giant maps. It's got like 6 or 8 decks of cards. It's got I don't know, a million charts. But maybe it's going to be my next favorite thing in strategic World War II gaming. Who knows? I look forward to it. Books. Well, not too much to report here. I'm currently about a third of the way through The Campaigns of Napoleon by David Chandler. This is kind of a classic. I couldn't get a paper copy at my library, so I found an ebook, which is great. I love reading ebooks, but the only downside when reading history books on ebooks is the maps. The maps, they just, depending on who's produced the ebook, and this one is not a very good job, they don't make the maps like a full page, or a full screen. So I'm missing out a little bit on that. But still, I'm enjoying reading some real history about Napoleon, as I've missed taking in the movie, and maybe that's for the best, given what the reviews have been like from historians and gamers. Newbie tips. Wargame rulebooks can be daunting for new players to the hobby. Even players with a lot of experience with Euros or hobby games can be brought up short by wargame rulebooks. So the easiest way to learn a new game is to have someone teach you. To that end, I've set up a new channel on the Pushing Cardboard Discord server dedicated to new players wanting to learn a specific game. You can post there and we'll try to match you up with someone who can teach you, or at the very least, another newbie who's interested in the same game, and you can learn together. I remember in the dark ages when I was first learning war games, I had to push through all those rule books on my own. There's no internet, and that was no big deal. But I was really starved for fellow players. I was playing everything on my own, so I had to learn everything on my own. And it taught me a certain aptitude for big rule sets, and to not be intimidated by long rule books. I'm really grateful for how things work now. Once I got on Board Game Geek and started playing a lot of games via Vassal PBEM, I've had several players teach me games that they're old hands at, and it really speeds up the learning. So please come join us. Don't be shy. There's an invite in the invite to the Discord server in the newsletter and in the show notes. Just click on that and make your way through and come and say hello. Okay, rather than a game dive this month, this time we're going to take a look at the past year. Some top 10 lists, some poll results, and a bit of a look at the year ahead. First up, I did a poll about what were your favorite games released in the past 2 years. I opened it up to 2 years this time because when I did this same poll last year, the biggest response was from folks who hadn't played any of their new games yet. So this time we allowed games released in 2022 and 2023, and happily, I only got one person who said that they hadn't played any of their new games from the past 2 years. We had 71 votes for this, and as you might expect, they were sort of all over the place, as everyone has their own favorites. But there was a clear winner, as Salerno 43 from Mark Simonich and GMT Games had 7 votes. After that, it gets a little muddier. Skies Above Britain, The British Way, Pacific War, On to Richmond 2, and Downfall all came in second with 4 votes each. A Greater Victory, the Musket and Pike Dual Pack, and Undaunted Stalingrad all had 3 votes, and then after that, it was all over the place with 23 different games getting 1 or 2 votes each. I guess the big takeaway for me is I need to do a big dive into Salerno 43 and report back to listeners, because it seems to be a lot of people's favorite games and something people are interested in hearing about. The other related poll asked about gaming goals for 2024. We had 31 responses for this one, and in first place by a wide margin was people wanted to play more from my unplayed pile. Not surprising. I don't know many gamers who don't have games on their shelf that they haven't played yet. So I have to count myself in that category as well. Tied for second place were play more face-to-face and learn more systems, and then followed closely by go to more conventions and replay more games going deeper. So that was interesting to see, a close split between those wanting to learn more games and those wanting to explore their current games more deeply. Also of interest, as I only had a single vote for buy fewer games. So perhaps the economy is doing okay after all. I made a couple of lists of my current favorite games. I'm just going to give the top 5 of each, but there's longer lists on the website if you want to see a top 30 or something like that. These are a snapshot in time and can change from month to month, I'm sure, but the first list was my favorite games that you can play in an evening. So, games you can play in under 4 hours, hopefully. As of right now, I list my top 5 in that category as Napoleon 1807 from Shakos, Rommel in the Desert from Columbia, Bayonets and Tomahawks from GMT, Up Front, the good old Avalon Hill favorite, and Blue versus Gray, the card game. It was most recently released by GMT, but it's been long out of print, and I sort of have a feeling it's never going to get reprinted. But I just love that game. If you ever get a chance to see it or play it, jump on it. It's terrific. And the second list was my current favorite games to play if I have as much time as I want to play them. So all day, a couple of days, whatever. My list is the U.S. Civil War, Bayonets and Tomahawks, ASL, The Guns of Gettysburg, and A Greater Victory, South Mountain from Revolution. It was interesting to see after I'd put these lists together that on this second list, I didn't really put any monster games on the top of the list. I guess I'm getting old. Who knows? Also of note, Bayonets and Tomahawks is on both lists. Obviously, I'm happy to play either a short scenario or the whole darn thing. Really kind of love that game. And then finally, here's 5 games from my unplayed shelves that I'm most eager to play. I have to say, choosing just 5 was nigh impossible, but here you go. Axis Empires, Salerno 43, Blazing Chariots, 1812 War on the Great Lakes Frontier, and Old School Tactical Volume 1. I could have listed 20 more for sure, maybe 50. Anyway, maybe next episode we'll talk about what games we're excited to see released in 2024. But all in all, it was a pretty great 2023 for gaming, and I've still got a lot on my shelves to keep me busy for a long time. Okay, time to hear from David Thompson. Well, many of you will know him from his solitaire games such as Pavlov's House. I'm a total fan of his Undaunted series, co-designed with Trevor Benjamin. And I'm extra happy to find out he's a big fan of podcasts. Like me, he can't sit still and watch YouTube videos, but loves to listen to podcasts as he does other things. I was excited to speak with him last November. Here's our conversation. All right, I'm here with David Thompson and we're coming to you from SD HistCon. We're on the last day of the convention. We're both a bit zooey from being up late and playing a lot of games. How are you, David?
Yeah, I'm great.
You've had a good time. You're here. you've been doing some demoing and some playing, right?
Yeah, so I was here demoing with Liz Davidson. We're demoing our game Night Witches, which is with Fort Circle.
With Fort Circle, yeah.
And we're basically at the point now where the design is pretty much complete, and we're just about to start external playtesting, like unguided playtests, right? For mostly for data collection, for balancing scenarios and stuff. So this was sort of the last hurrah of just making sure that the core game we're super happy with, and checking in with Kevin Bertram with Fort Circle to say, hey, here's what we've got. We're all in agreement. The design is pretty much complete. We're going to do this final bit of development and play testing, and then that'll be basically the design done, right?
Right.
And then it can move on to art
and then you open it up to like a bit of a wider play test, so you get people who are coming to it fresh, and that's a whole different kind of a play test.
Yeah, I mean, every game requires kind of its own. Why are we play testing this, right? And it just play tests are all very different depending on the style of game. This is a game that lends itself well to, if the design is solid, right? In this case, I think it is. The core, we're not really testing the core anymore at this point. And so really what we're looking for is two things. Liz has written what I think is a really good rule book. So we want to send the rule book out to players for unguided play tests, so just to see if they have questions about the rules, right? Can you interpret the rules? We're not asking you feedback on the core rule, just can you understand and play without?
Yeah, can you play it?
Yeah. So that's one key piece, and then the other piece is, like I said before, just balancing. This game lends itself really well to data collection and analysis to inform a lot of the decisions we make about difficulty. Not all games do. This one does really well, and so it gives us a really good opportunity to collect a lot of data back for that.
Well, that's an interesting idea, because there you're talking about balance, and I'm thinking, yeah, balance is important, and then I went, wait a minute, this is a solo game. What?
Well, solo and co-op, right?
Solo and co-op, but still, it's like it's you versus Mm-hmm. It's the player or players versus the machine, in a way, or the paper machine.
Yeah.
And you've designed, you've got a lot of great solo designs out there, but you still think of it as balance. Mm-hmm. Like what when you're talking about a solo game?
Yeah.
What does balance mean? What does that? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. So people have different opinions about what a solo experience, a solo game should look like from a win percentage level, right? So in the game, in Night Witches specifically, there are 3 different levels of difficulty, and those adjust organically to the player depending on how well they're doing. So if they're doing really well, the game is going to scale and be more difficult to them. And there's payoff at the end for that. We're not just making it hard for the sake of making it hard.
Right.
So there is sort of this a broader acceptable spectrum of difficulty within the game itself, right? It goes from the easiest to the hardest level, but that's okay. But if people are only winning the hardest version of the game 1% of the time on a scenario, that's a problem.
Right.
It has to be achievable.
That would be unbalanced.
Right. Exactly. So we're looking for what's the acceptable spectrum, within each level of difficulty.
Right.
Because you want most of the results to hover around that sort of moderate level of difficulty, and then you want an acceptable percentage in each of the easier and the harder, right?
And what's acceptable?
That's good. Well, I think we're going to my feeling is we want players to not spend much time in that lowest level, right? That's sort of like, hey, you've done poorly maybe in this one, we'll give you a chance to catch up kind of deal. So not a lot, right? I think I'm speaking for myself. Liz and I haven't had this explicit conversation, but let's say maybe 20% of the plays are in that lowest level, and then maybe 40% in the medium, and then 40% in the hardest, right? Something like that.
Right. And the people, and how often should people win?
So the game is interesting in that it doesn't have necessarily. Now this is a campaign style game, right? Importantly, it's not something like Undaunted Stalingrad where you have to play them sequentially. The scenarios you can jump in scenario 7 and play it, so that's fine. But we designed it such that you're playing them sequentially, and so there is no winning and losing. No matter how well or poorly you do in a scenario, you're going to go to the next one.
Right.
But if you do poorly, the game will be easier for you. But at the very end of the campaign, without getting into too much of the history and stuff like this is a Soviet unit, and you're trying to reach guards status, which they did historically.
Right.
It's very hard. So you're going to have to do well pretty consistently throughout the entire game to achieve guard status.
Right. So it's not you're not going to fail 99% of the time, but you might fail 80% of the time.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
For I should say, for anybody who isn't aware of this game, this is Night Witches. This is about Soviet World War II era female night bombing pilots.
That's right.
Yeah. They were so ahead of the curve in using women in the military.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of that comes out of, it was communists, Soviet Union, and there was a lot of talk for equality and equity in that period in communist Soviet Union. Now, some of that they were rolling back at the time, etc. But certainly in World War II, and when it comes to women combatants, Soviet Union was kind of their own thing compared to the rest of the world, right?
Yeah, their sniper units are kind of legendary, right? Yeah.
Right. They could basically do almost any job except for frontline infantry, and I mean, you're not going to have a sapper who's not going to pick up a rifle when they're confronted by the enemy, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a famous story, for example, of an air defense unit defending northern Stalingrad and having do direct fire against an incoming panzer unit. Right, so it's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, totally terrifying. Well, to broaden this out, to talk more about you and not just this one game, how many games do you have out there published by now?
It's about, I think, about 25.
That's quite. When did you start publishing games?
So the first one was published in 2016.
Right. So that's that we cut 1 year off. That's 5 games a year.
My personal goal is 4 games a year.
And that pretty much is 4 games a year, right? Yeah. It's 24 games in 6 years.
Yeah.
What have you always been a gamer? Were you a historical gamer? Because most of your games are history games.
Yeah. No. So I've basically always been a gamer.
Yeah.
Grew up on role-playing games.
Yeah.
So I did not become a board gamer until about 2010 or so. As a matter of fact, like many hobby stores, my only exposure really to board games was when I would go in to buy role-playing games or comic books or whatever. There would be something like Twilight Imperium sitting at the front of the store, and I was like, that looks really cool. I have no idea what that is. I'm sure it's fun. I did play a few things like Blood Bowl, things like that, right? Yeah. They were popular enough to kind of exist.
They get into your high school or something,
Yeah, but I didn't really know even that the board game hobby existed really until about 2010. And then I was always the dungeon master in D&D, right? So I've always had that creative outlet. And so when I discovered board gaming, I immediately started saying, I wonder if I could design some games.
Right.
That didn't take long. Now, when I moved to the UK in 2014 was really the critical. There was a lot of things that came together at exactly the same time to go from this is interesting to I'm really interested in pursuing it. Moved to the UK, immediately joined a playtest and design group in Cambridge.
And what did you move to the UK to do?
For my day job.
For your day job,
for my day job, And I work for the Department of Defense.
Right.
So I went there to work on an RAF base near Cambridge. But Cambridge has an absolutely amazing design community from all over the world. Very few Brits, ironically, right? Because Cambridge is such an international city.
Right.
So it was great. And there were a couple of key people, Brett Gilbert and Matt Dunstan, who are very prolific, successful board game designers who created that group. And I moved there in June or July of 2014, and a couple of months later I was going to Spiel, right? Their mentorship and introducing the pitching and all that stuff.
Yeah, and it's over here in North America where we're recording this, half the people involved in the game industry or in the war game industry have no idea what a big deal Spiel is. It's this giant German game convention / trade show, and it must be the biggest one in the world, right?
It is the biggest one in the world. People will argue about it in Gen Con, but they're two very different things. Even if the attendance is similar, Gen Con is this cultural event kind of thing, right? It has all sorts of different stuff going on. But Essen is really about selling games, essentially, to families and stuff. And like you said, a trade show. And it's all board games, right? It's not, there's a little bit of other stuff, but it's board games.
It's board games,
So they're both super crazy and not my kind of thing, but they are very different. Yeah.
It's not your kind of thing, but also for certain games in your portfolio, there must have been Spiel must have been like an important cog in getting a game launched or getting a game bought. Or
yeah, absolutely. I don't do a lot of this anymore, and I'll come back to your question about the military history piece. Most of my games now are historical games, military. Not all of them, but most of them. But when I was first designing, that was not the case. And so, like, I have a game with Cosmos, which is a German publisher, right?
Right.
I wouldn't have ever had an opportunity to design it with Cosmos had I not been in going to Spiel and meeting with them and that kind of stuff. It opens up a lot of doors.
Did you go there and like pitch them your game, or
yeah, absolutely,
did the whole thing, and that's a big part of what's going on there, right?
Right, absolutely, yeah. This is an interesting thing that doesn't get talked about a lot, but we're operating in the not war game hobby space. And operating the war game from a designer perspective, it's extremely different. Extremely different.
Yeah.
Right? The historical game, war game hobby isn't, I would submit that like designing and pitching a game is secondary to knowing people. Right? Knowing people is the key. And I'm not saying that knowing people is not important in the broader hobby market, but you can know someone super well, but you still have to call Asmodee up and set a meeting and meet with them officially. And it's just a much more business-like, official experience.
Right.
So it's very different.
Here in the wargaming side of the hobby, we're a niche within a niche, and that lets us be a little bit more of like a mom and pop shops and stuff like that. I mean, even if you think of GMT, you go to GMT West events, and it's like somebody inviting you into his warehouse and saying, "Come on, pals, play." Those guys are. Right. It feels like a family-run thing. Yeah, and it sort of is.
It is, yeah, and it very much feels that way. And I'll tell you this. You can't design a good / interesting historical game and not get it signed. It will find a home. That's not true in the hobby market. You can design a great game, but it has to be the right time for the market, and you have to you have to go through and pitch it, and the pitch has to go well, and it's a very different environment.
So this is like a chicken and the egg question then. When you kind of moved more towards historical games away from hobby games, was it because you were more interested in how you found it more interesting just talking to the people that you were designing for in these small companies, or was it just because you found yourself more interested in the historical research and that part of the design process?
So this is interesting. I don't know quite the answer to that. I think it was some of both mixed together. I wasn't really into military history, again, until about that same time in 2014 when I moved to the UK. And the very first vacation we went on was to go to Normandy. And my son at the time was about 5 or 6 months old, and he was named after my grandfather. My grandfather landed on Omaha Beach.
Right.
And I remember, there's a handful of things in people's lives who you can say, like, that was a moment that was a defining moment for me, right? And I distinctly remember kind of lowering his little feet into the water in Omaha Beach. And I was like, this is pretty incredible, right? It was a very moving moment.
Yeah, a real family moment, like 4 generations across the spectrum there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, Undaunted Normandy is based after my grandfather's unit,
right?
The 30th ID, and so I went from sort of like, oh, that's interesting, to no, this is something I'm passionate about pretty quickly, and that just was very much organic. But I think as that interest grew and I started becoming more, into the hobby, the two things just kind of fed off of one another, right? And so I think that the community in the hobby being so embracing, right, and being so closely tied to the military history piece, fed into my interests, which then fed back into the hobby, and they just became this cyclical.
It's this virtuous circle, sort of.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, I found my home.
Yes. Yeah. And at the time when I first started designing games, I mean, it sounds a little silly, but I didn't really know myself, right? I was just kind of throwing stuff out there. I didn't know what I was doing. And now, if I look back at some of those games, it's like those don't really reflect my style of design.
Right. You found your voice.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny too, because it's like I've talked to other designers and about their first games, and sometimes I publish them themselves or whatever, and sometimes it's just because your point about who is very important, because sometimes people end up self-publishing because they they just don't know. They don't know the business at all. They don't know who to talk to, basically, and stuff. And once you get in, you're not. It's not like to say you're an insider. It's not like some big secret society. There's no closed doors here. There's no people shutting anybody out. This community is actually pretty interested in seeing what anybody has to offer, no matter what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an extremely inviting community.
Yeah.
Once you find it. I mean, you have to kind of know, like, this is an interesting thing. I didn't know this existed. But,
well, even as a player, when you're first getting into games, you might only buy games from one or two publishers because that's all that's available in your town, or that's all you're even aware of. And it takes a while before you see there's a really big community of tiny bits,
right?
Yes. Lots of tiny publishers, lots of little conventions, and lots of we are a niche within a niche, but we're a mighty niche.
And that's the thing that I love about our part of the hobby, the historical gaming piece, is that we're all pretty much passionate. I mean, you can't find a historical gamer that's not passionate about their hobby. They're not just kind of like showing up for the game day once a month and kind of just there, right?
It's there's been a bit of controversy in the hobby recently about how whether we ignore certain parts of difficult history that really ought to be in games and stuff like that. And I'm sympathetic to that point of view, of course. But on the other hand, I also feel like there's nobody who's into these games who isn't really aware of the history. Like there's nobody who's into history games who's not into history.
Right.
Like history game nerds and history book nerds. The Venn diagram is a circle, right? It's
and I think the most important thing is that all of those people having those discussions are genuinely passionate about what they're playing, and there's a room enough for all those different opinions in that hobby, right? As long as we treat each other respectfully.
That's exactly. I'll tolerate anything except intolerance.
That's
absolutely.
Right.
Well, speaking of that kind of like getting along together, you also work a lot with other designers, like you and not. I mean, you and Trevor Benjamin a ton, but that's not like you have quite a few design partners. Recently, have all your games been partnerships?
Yeah, there was a period when I first started working on some solo wargame stuff, right? So if you look back to things like Pavlov's House or Castle Litter, those were solo designs. So I used to say that I would design solo war games by myself, and I would design other things with other people, right? And there were some practical reasons for that and stuff like that. But even then, when I started working on other solo war games, I started collaborating with folks who I would ask to serve as like a sort of historical consultant / co-designer, right? And so,
what was the first one where you brought somebody in to do that with you?
So there was a couple of games that were happening at the same time. So. By Stealth and Sea, which is Human Torpedo game, and then Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms. In both those cases, the co-design partner was both a gamer, a very serious gamer, and a historical expert in the subject matter.
Right. Yeah.
And so I kind of instantly recognized that there's really no reason for me to ever do this by myself. There's just so many benefits to doing it as a co-design, and there's really no drawbacks. If it's a multiplayer game, there's the obvious benefit, the practical benefit of you don't have to look for another player, a tester. You've got the other, the designer. There's all the obvious benefits about creativity and working together and that kind of stuff. From a purely practical perspective, it helps me hold myself accountable. Right. I mean, that's really important.
This is something I hear from lots of designers who co-design. It's like, I would be too lazy, or I wouldn't, they serve as my deadline.
Yeah.
I have
100%.
I have to treat them as well as I have to behave as well as I expect them to behave towards me. And
even though this is not my job, I essentially treat it like a job. Right. So when I leave a meeting with one of my design partners, we leave with action items that have to be accomplished before the next meeting, and depending on the designer, this is a little bit different because each design relationship's its own personality or its own relationship.
Right.
So you have to kind of manage like you would manage any other individual relationship, right? They're not all the same. You can't treat them the same. But usually we're going to set a weekly meeting or whatever it is, and these are the things we have to get done before that. And it's super important in terms of just helping propel the game forward.
And do you find yourself doing this? Well, you said it's different with every partnership. Mm-hmm. And I know I've talked to you before about like when you and Trevor are working on something, there's certain things that you generally do and there's certain things that he generally does. Yeah. But then when you work with, say, Liz, mm-hmm. is the division completely different, or?
Yeah, it is. It's definitely different on the designer. Now, if I can get my design partner to write the rule book for every game, then I'm a winner. Right? That's what I don't want to do.
So that's the one thing you want to try and offload.
But seriously, sometimes when I enter a new relationship, a new design relationship, we'll have like explicit discussions about who's going to be responsible for what. Usually that falls out organically pretty quickly, right? But they're all different spectrums, and it depends on the person. So, for example, there's things that Trevor will always do. He'll always take our development notes. He'll always write the rule book. I'll always do all the tabletop simulator work and all the file creation and all that stuff. And we have a very, very regimented system between the two of us. Liz and I followed a very similar pattern when we worked on it. Jeff Engelstein and I had a very sort of similar but different. Like we had some overlapping responsibilities when we worked on Chung-Ha. Roger Tankersley, who's somebody I work with a lot also, we have a slightly different relationship because oftentimes I would say I fall on like the more creative side in terms of like scenario design, that kind of things. And but Roger's really good at that stuff, like art briefs and those kind of things. So he kind of falls even further on the spectrum than I do in that. So I take on some of the notes taking, right? So each one is different, right?
Right. You'd said that there's obvious benefits with having like creativity and all sorts of like that, and I think that's absolutely true. But there is also like there's a possibility of that being, going completely south, right? It's like you could team up with somebody that you're just not compatible with. I don't want you to name any names or anything like that, but do you ever go like, that was interesting, but I don't think I'm going to work with that person again, or?
Yeah. Yes, I've had a couple of experiences where I was like, okay, we got through that, but probably I'm just not super compatible with that person. I don't necessarily need to work with them again. There's also been experiences where it's like, I don't think it was fine. It was perfectly cordial, but we probably just didn't gel as much as we needed to be successful in our partnership, right? Now, for better or worse, the vast majority of my design partnerships have been with people that I'm close friends with before we designed together.
Right.
Jeff is a little bit of an outlier because Jeff reached out to me. We knew who each other was, but we were barely associates.
Right.
So that was interesting. We were developing that design relationship without a background of friendship. So that was an interesting difference.
You're starting from zero in a way.
Yeah. But it's been many, many years since I've had that experience. Just because I have, and I'm super blessed, but I have most of my design work now is like contracted with companies. I'm not designing a game to pitch to somebody anymore.
Right.
Very seldom.
So you're not having to pitch you might have a game that you want and you think it's like you can just talk to a publisher and say, I think this would be a fit for you, or they might ask you and say,
they come to me.
They come to you and say, do you have a game we're looking for this, or
And that's I'll tell you right now, that's the most challenging thing that's happened, and this is not uncommon. Is a publisher will come to me. This has happened quite a few times in the last couple of years, and they'll just say, hey, we want you to design a game for us. But it can be any game.
Right.
And it's like, okay, that's not going to work. Somebody has to give me constraints.
Right. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're going to get like this giant thing that's not going to fit in a room.
Right. And I am not the kind of guy, like I'm not a mechanic first designer or whatever, right? Like it has to be something, this tangible idea, this historical idea, or whatever it is, this theme that is the underpinning for the game. So I need that starting constraint. So you can come to me with any topic in the world. I can tell you if I can design a game about it. But don't tell me just design anything.
Don't give you carte blanche, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'm not a solo player, so I haven't played your Castle Litter and those games, but I love your two-player games, your Undaunted games and stuff. And one of the things that I like about them is the thought that's gone into the physical components, and it's not about the quality of the components, but it's about like everything's here, like everything's right in front of me. Everything, they're not. They're in the games I played they're not traditional hex encounter war games. There's something inviting about them. It seems to me that you're deliberately aiming for a wider audience than to say, yeah, wargamers are going to like this, but maybe other people will as well. Like, is that been a conscious effort?
Yeah. I mean, going back to as far back as Undaunted, which the design for that started in 2014. So it was in work in some state for 5 years before it was released, right? It was always intended to be sort of this crossover game. And I always say, and this is true, I always sort of thought of it as a game that was either going to be successful in crossing over between the war game world and the broader hobby world, or like nobody was going to like it. Right. Because it was just, what is this beast? But a lot of decisions about the game. So first of all, we should give credit to Osprey, because Osprey did an incredible job in the development.
It's gorgeous. Yeah.
So many of the things that are just incredible, besides the art, which is in and of itself great, just every piece of art is a unique person. Every single person is named. Like these very minor but important things. You don't typically see that from a war game publisher, right? They don't have that approach. But some things were very deliberate decisions, like the way the tiles are set up in the game. It's a hex.
Oh, I was going to say,
right?
That's a hex group. You've turned a hex grid into squares.
Into squares, yeah. But if a person walks by and they see hexes and little war game tokens and stuff, it's going to look more and more like a war game.
It's going to spook them a little bit if they're spookable.
Right. And so, I mean, it needed to walk that fine line. It needed to look as little like a war game, but still have war game elements in it, right? And so again, it was going to either be a crossover or nobody wanted to play it. So a lot of those decisions were, that was the sort of guidelines when I was designing it. Right.
Yeah. So when it clicked in my head that the offset squares or tiles actually was a hex grid, I just thought, oh, that's genius, because I instantly understood that it was a way of doing hexes without doing hexes.
Right. Yeah.
And you still had 6 different directions that you could go.
Right.
But it's not off-putting to people who aren't raised on hexes. Yeah.
And as long as you're not doing like directional fire and things like that, it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't have line of sight.
Yeah.
Of course, when we came with Battle of Britain, all of a sudden it became easier to transition to a hex grid, right? Right. But at that point, people know Undaunted.
They've been weaned on the system through three boxes already, or 4 boxes already. Yeah. The other thing about that system that people would probably notice, and maybe grumpy old grognards would notice, is like there's a real effort to put people of color in some of that art and stuff like that, where like we all know there's the people of color fought in the war, but not a lot of units were integrated and stuff like that, and I'm sure you got some pushback about some of that stuff. So it made me think you must have this had to be as well like a real conscious decision.
Yeah.
So the same with the Sikh pilots in Battle of Britain. It's like, I mean, if you're a Commonwealth guy, these guys fought, but
So I can tell you stories about each individual box. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. It was very much a deliberate decision. And it's a decision,
it had to be.
And it's a decision that we meaning Trevor and I, made with Osprey. We were all talked about it. We all agreed, hey, this is what we want to do. And I should also mention explicitly Roland McDonald, the artist, right? Because he's the one creating all the art.
Yeah, and it's so cool.
Yeah, I love him so much. He's amazing, super talented. But when we can talk about each game as much as we want in this discussion, because each one is a little bit different. But just talking about the first game with Undaunted Normandy, it's both white and black soldiers, both on the cover and throughout the game on the American side.
Yeah.
And typically what I'll get is there's a lot of stuff that we can't even say here without it's
inflaming the world.
Right. It's just horrible things that I couldn't repeat. So I get a lot of those comments, a lot of private comments, a lot of public comments, and that's fine. That's fine. But the thing that really bothers me, and I don't reply about negative comments on my games usually, but I will comment on this. People will say, some people will say there were no black soldiers, which is just, okay, that's just wrong.
Yeah, yes.
Usually what you'll hear are either there were no combatants, which is also wrong, or there were no integrated units.
Right. It's not no integrated units.
Right. and so there were, most people who kind of know World War II history or whatever, they know that there were African American units, combat units. Now, I would not have a problem if somebody said the 30th Infantry Division, about which the game was never integrated, and I have an issue with that.
Right.
I also wouldn't necessarily have a problem with people saying that rifle platoons were not integrated up through the Battle of Mortain, which is when Undaunted Normandy ends, which is also true. Those two, but no one's ever said either of those. They've always said there were never any integrated rifle platoons, which is not true.
Well, it's not true, yeah.
Right after the Battle of the Bulge, there were.
Yeah.
Now, I will say the goodness out of that, I've fought that fight many times. I've set a lot of people straight and said that's just not true. I'm working on the game now about 5th platoons, which were the integrated platoons after the Battle of the Bulge. Just let's tell that story, right? Because there's a lot of ignorance about this. So let's tell that story.
So I've listened to you guys come at me with.
Yeah, right.
I'm just going to dig in harder and I'm going to give it to you.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Did you have the same thing about the North Africa box?
Yeah. So North Africa was not as bad. Some people will say, hey, there weren't Indians or whatever, and that's not true. Like there was an Indian patrol that was similar to what became the LRDG, right? So that's not true. Stalingrad, people know enough about women in the Soviet Union to know that most people know there were. I had one. This was great. One guy just could not deal with the fact that the percentage of the Soviet Red Army was not high enough women that it justified the inclusion of women in the game. So I was like, I don't know what that number is that it requires, but
this is what we chose to put in there.
Again, these are the kind of things I do comment on. So I immediately replied back with like the number of Soviet snipers and all the people they killed and all this stuff. I was just like, look, it's a Soviet sniper on the cover for a reason because they were very effective. The Battle of Britain one's an interesting one because we included like a black Western Caribbean pilot and a Sikh pilot. Yeah. And they're actually modeled, they're not designed to be representative of an actual person, but they're inspired by actual people.
Right.
Now, again, it is true there were not black Western Caribbean pilots or Sikh pilots that fought in the RAF actively during the exact days that the UK represents the Battle of Britain. That is a true fact. The game, somebody could argue the game shouldn't be titled Battle of Britain because it actually takes place both before and after those dates. But I think if we went and asked even most like war gamers or military history buffs, what were the exact dates of the Battle of Britain? I don't think many people know those dates, right? And so I'm sure there are people who are genuinely upset about that from a historical accuracy perspective. I'm sure there are. But it's not the majority of the people who raise the complaints.
No, and the thing the things that's the nail in the coffin of the argument, as far as I'm concerned, is a series like Undaunted is a series that is not. It's not bending over backwards for historical verisimilitude. It's way more into the middle in terms of like I want to have a balance between playability and historicity.
Right.
And so, like, we don't care how many rivets are on a tank in this game.
Right.
So, having a slight fudge of the dates of when an African American served or Sikhs served, it's like that doesn't seem to be to me all that much different than the way other corners are sanded off in terms of getting all the historical details exactly just right.
Right. Yeah, and the thing that there's a little bit annoying about this is, other than mostly Brits who are upset about the inclusion of those folks on Battle of Britain, we had a lot of Polish people who were upset that it didn't like the inclusion. There wasn't inclusion of the 303rd, for example, or something like that. And here's the deal. I design soldiers' postmen's uniforms. I'm very into Poland, World War II history. a lot of respect for it. There's a lot of games about the 303rd.
Yeah,
Right?
it's true.
Like,
yeah.
if you want a game about the 303rd, there are entire games dedicated to it.
I think there's a game just called the 303rd.
Right. Yeah. So the fact that when we look across all the covers of World War II, RAF, aerial combat games, I'm not sure there's many Sikhs on the cover.
Yeah,
You know?
no,
So
totally.
I think we can have one cover in one game that that has that representation.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm not going to dwell on that anymore because I think you've spoken eloquently to it. But I think we're on the same page. I want to go back to a little bit though about your games in terms of the user experience and the ergonomics, because there's something about having everything right. Like when I'm playing your games, I'm not looking at charts and tables very much at all. That must be another key part of your design philosophy, that things are on the table where you're looking.
Yeah, for sure. For sure, elegance in the design is a huge focus for me. I approach every game. Every game has its own Chrome budget, right, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So this is my Chrome budget. Now, that budget is dictated by the audience of the game, right? So if I'm designing a solitaire war game for wargamers, my Chrome budget skyrockets, right? If I'm designing a game for a crossover game, I don't want people looking in the book. I don't really want them even having to use play rates. Like they should, once they've learned the game, it should be there.
Right. So if it's a crossover game, the thing, exactly the thing I'm talking about, we're not looking at player aids.
Yeah.
Once we know the game and we know what each of the actions is, we just look at the board.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I'm definitely in the category of the grog who like can take the Chrome budget all the way up.
Right.
But I adore, on the other hand, being able to just look at the board and not look away from the board and see everything.
Yeah, and there's like, I don't design a lot of complex games, but I play them. You know, I don't play much at all. Period. But when I do play them, I have no problem playing that way, playing those times of crunchier games. But I don't have a ton of time to work on designs, and when I do, it's for me, that feels like where I'm more naturally capable of contributing in a meaningful way to our hobby, right? Hey, I'll go to either the solitaire games or the lighter, more crossover style stuff. So that's definitely a focus for me.
Well, that's interesting. I was going to ask you about that because I think of you right now as kind of like the king of the solitaire games. Those are that series of games you've done are like, they just seem to be gold, but I love your multiplayer games. How do you decide which you're going to do, or
that's a good question. Oftentimes it's the topic, and so let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So there's a Spanish company, Salt and Pepper. They reached out to me. Historically they'd always done localizations. The lead of the company, though, is a wargamer, and he has in addition to being a publisher, he has a blog where he reviews a lot of games, and he liked my solo games. So he's an example of somebody that reached out and said, hey, I want you to design a game. You can design any game you want, right? He wanted it to be the first original game they published, not a localization, that was going to be both English and Spanish language. He wanted a game from me. And so...
And he didn't care if it was solo or...
He's just, you can design whatever you want, right? Whatever you want. So
I know which game it's going to become, but
right. So I thought, okay, this isn't good. I need to build my own constraints. So I'm going to do a game that pays homage to Spain during World War II.
Right.
This makes sense because it's a Spanish publisher.
Yeah.
And so I thought about a couple of different things, but ultimately settled on the Spanish Maquis. Right.
Maquis,
so the game is the Resist.
It's the Spanish Resistance.
The Spanish Resistance. Yeah. So when people hear the word Maquis, so military history buffs will think of Maquis and they'll know the French Maquis. Yeah. If you're a Star Trek fan, you'll know the Maquis from Star Trek. But very few people know the Spanish Maquis, right? And they got their name, of course, from the French Maquis,
right?
Partially trained by them in the SOE. When people see Resist, they assume it's a Spanish Civil War game, right? They don't know that, as World War II was winding down, there were these resistance fighters who they thought that by allying with the Allies would then help them
get rid of Franco.
Yeah. Of course, that did not happen.
Yeah, no. He lasted till 75 or something. Yeah.
Right. And so, the idea of I'm going to make a game, and the game is going to be about the resistance against Franco, and you can't win the resistance. You cannot overthrow Franco. right? The game has a point threshold that if you reach it, you overthrow Franco. I don't know that I've actually publicly said this before. You can't get that score, right? You can't actually overthrow Franco, right? But the point of the game is it should feel crushing the entire time, right? Like, this is horrible. How am I ever going to win? And we're giving up people's lives to accomplish these missions and things like this. It's a very serious topic, right? Now, it's an interesting game because the art for it is this interesting sort of almost old style cartoony look, but it doesn't make it a light topic.
No.
The
old school art cartoony can be scary,
right,
or disturbing.
Yeah. And so
the way you're describing that game, it's like it sounds like a game you could have pitched to Hollandspiel.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I would agree with that very much so. But that's a game. I don't want to put somebody in the role of Franco. Right. Franco's forces. So it makes sense to be a solitaire game, maybe co-op, right? The Grizzled or something like that. Yeah. But in this case, the decision was, hey, you're leading a band of resistance. That's who you are as the player, and so it made sense for it to be a solitaire play game. And another example, just one more, is in most of my Valiant Defense games, which are solitaire games. Really, they're designed to be solitaire. There is a variant that allows you to play the adversary, and it's mostly there so that you can play the adversary and teach your friend who's interested in the game how to play. Right. You're just taking rules load off of them, right? It's not it's not a two-player game, right? You're not getting nearly the fun out of it. One of the games in this series, Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms, I don't allow for that. I didn't create a variant where you could play the adversary, and the reason for that is you're playing the defenders of a post office, mostly civilian, a little bit of paramilitary, civilian postal workers. There are civilians in the building, to include a janitor, his wife, and their daughter. Now, you're fighting against Danzig City Police and SS and SA troops, and they set the building on fire and killed those people. Right. And you're not going to do that in my game. Right. And I had a few people reach out, and they were very, very upset. They were very upset that I did not create a variant for that game. And I said, this is the reason why I didn't create it. I was polite. I was saying, hey, this is the reason why.
It's just too horrific to put somebody in.
I'm not going to give a player agency to make those decisions in the game. And it was interesting that they were so upset about it, right? And I mean, I didn't say this. Part of me wanted to be like, look, I mean, it's not rocket science how to create the variant. It basically plays like Castle Litter and Pavlov said. You can do it yourself if you want. But that's
But that's on you.
That's on you. That's right. That's right. And then I guess the one final reason is Landsworth Ridge would be an example of this. Sometimes you have a situation in Landsworth Ridge. You're a platoon of 20 guys. You're holding out against about 500 Germans. Right. Okay.
It's so one-sided.
It's so one-sided, and if I gave both players the realistic agency that the leaders in those two combats had, the Germans would win in about 10 minutes. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, how do you? You have two choices. You make it a multiplayer game, and you hamstring the German player to the point where they're probably not going to have a fun time playing. Right. Because you can't do all the things you'd want to do.
You just put a bunch of anchors on them.
Right. Yeah. Right. Or you make it a solitaire game. And now I can make the Germans as stupid as they really were in that battle, and the other player can have a lot of fun. Right. So those are the kind of reasons that lead to one decision over the other.
And it just comes up in terms of what the topic is, and then you go, okay, this is what it needs to be. Yeah. In terms of your historical games, are they? I think they've all been pretty much World War II. Is that your?
I mean, this is super, nitnoid, but except for Resist, right? Because it takes place right after, literally in the last year. Yeah. I think that's true. I don't think I've done any. Well, I created a game called Europe Divided, which is a post-Cold War, one player takes control of NATO and the EU, and the other takes control of Russia. Right. And it starts in basically 91 and goes to about 2018. So that's it. Yeah.
Are you when you're thinking about what you might do next? Is World War II, and it's such a big part of your design history? Is it your main focus, or can you see yourself doing a Civil War game or a Napoleonic game or whatever?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So one of the reasons that I do a lot of World War II games is when you look at my games, my historical games, there's two traits about them that I think stand out. One is they're set in World War II, and the other is they're almost always at like skirmish scale, meaning one person is a counter. Some of them are slightly zoomed out from that, like tactical scale.
You like tacticals and skirmish scale like that. That's zoomed right in. Yeah.
Now, and many of my like the actual more like historical focused ones, so like my solitaire games especially, are focused on real people. And they have the real people in the game. Right.
Yeah. The people in Pavlov's house is who was in
They're
Pavlov's
actually
house.
there. And they actually have the pictures, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you start to go back further than World War II, you start to struggle to get that level of detail down to the individual person level. So something has to give. Either I have to kind of like not concern myself with the actual people that were there, or something like that, right? So that's one reason. And I don't do modern stuff because, I've been there. I've been to Iraq, and I'm not doing anything modern times.
I'm totally with you. I tend to not play those games that much because I don't know. There's just I don't know why, but for some of us, it just feels too fresh.
Yeah, it's too close to home. There's a couple of like outpost cading and stuff, examples in Afghanistan where people have said this would be a great fit for Valiant Defense. The only way I would even consider doing it is to do it in conjunction with the military and meet with every single person that was part of that conflict and talk to them and make sure they're, and it's just not something I'm comfortable with. Right. So World War II kind of it like fits in that zone of like being far enough away that I'm okay with examining that level, but recent enough to have the historical detail to get down to that personal level.
Well, and to think about it too, if there's plenty of like these real small unit actions in World War II. But if you go back to the American Civil War, like the fighting didn't happen in the small unit action size. A little bit of it happened more on the Eastern Front in World War I, but it didn't happen a lot in World War. This is World War II is when things broke down into the maneuver units got to be so small in certain situations.
Yep. So there's some practical things. Now, independent of that, one thing that's happened. Again, this is a blessing. I'm not complaining about it. It's just the reality I live in. I've kind of become known as that guy. Right. And so what's happened in recent years is a co-design partner came to me recently, another guy I met in Cambridge. He's extremely well known. So Dave Neal, he's extremely well known for his narrative games. So he worked on like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective and some other games like that. And he wanted to do a co-design with me. And he's like, hey, let's do a World War II narrative war game. And I was like, I can do other things too besides World War II, but okay, that's fine. We'll do that. That works.
Right. So when people are coming to pitch you, the fact that you say, okay, number one, don't give me a blank slate, when the first thing they write at the top is World War II.
Right. That's right.
So, right.
Yep. So, but I'm not complaining at all. I love playing in that space. So.
Okay. Well, to wrap it up and ask you a couple more things at the end here. We've talked a lot about what you've done. What's coming up?
Yeah, so I can talk about the future of Undaunted. We could talk about that, right? Because that's been announced. So just recently it was announced that the next game will be Undaunted Callisto. So a lot of people thought that the next game was going to be Undaunted Pacific. And that's something that's interesting. There's a lot of different directions to go. I will say one possible obstacle for Undaunted Pacific is Pacific means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It could be carrier battles, it could be amphibious assault, it could be all sorts of different things.
Totally. It could be jungle warfare.
Yeah, exactly. It can be so many different things. And that's not the reason we didn't do it, but that is one thing to consider, right?
You have to figure out what you're going to do.
Right. What does that mean exactly? But there were two other things. One is that every Undaunted game has been very different. It has to have a reason to exist. It has to be different. And it has to be also different because otherwise Trevor and I will lose our minds because we spent a lot of time working on Undaunted. Right. It can't just be a reskin. And then separate, a lot of people have just said, Undaunted has become pretty popular, even not in the wargame space. And so a lot of people have said, I see a lot of stuff about this game. I don't want to play a military history game. Right? And so we finally said, okay, look, we've produced a lot. We've produced 5 different titles that are, hit military history games. Let's explore something else. Right. And so that led us to Callisto, and I can't go into a lot of details about it, but it introduces a lot of new things just from a gameplay perspective that allowed us to really explore this system in new ways. That was fun. I will say just from like the genre we were going for, it's a like a harder sci-fi or grittier kind of sci-fi experience.
Right. I was going to guess.
Yeah.
With the name, I thought this has got to be a sci-fi game. Is it a space game?
It is. So it will be. Again, I think I can talk about this to a certain extent. So it's set on Callisto, which one of Jupiter's moons. We needed to ground it in sort of a reality, right? So it's relatively near future, 2200.
Right.
What do you need if you're exploring space? You need ice for a lot of different reasons. So it made sense to set it on Callisto. This is an ice mining location, and the adversaries are realistic adversaries. So in this case, you have the people who are mining the ice against the people who are essentially responsible for selling the ice back to, et cetera, right? So it sets up sort of
ice miners.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's great. Fantastic. So, and that's going to be through Osprey.
Through Osprey.
Yeah. And everything else you're working on, you can't talk about yet.
We talked a lot about Night Witches, obviously. I will say we haven't talked about this game at all, but it's alongside Undaunted is my most popular game, and arguably more popular worldwide, and that's War Chest, which is an abstract combat game, right? Thankfully, this is awesome. The power of Kickstarter, we were able to do another expansion, so that'll come out next year. And that means a lot to me personally because that's the game I play most with my kids. Right? My son, unfortunately, I'm losing my son a little bit. He's 9 now and he's getting more into video games. Mm-hmm. It used to be that we would play almost every day, and almost every day he would ask me, Dad, when's the next War Chest coming out? So maybe I can trick him to play on War Chest with me a little bit when the expansion comes out. But
if anybody hasn't met you, you are a 100% family man.
Yes. So I won't dive into this too much, but my life is very compartmentalized. I do board game design in the morning, I do my day job, and then I come home and that's family time. And I try not to ever mix those things, together. So, most of I have one game day a month without my family, and the rest of the game time is
and that's when you play new games from other people and stuff.
Yeah, and I'm not a cult of the new guy. So the kind of stuff that I'm playing are things like Maria or something like that.
Right. But you're I think it's important for designers to keep playing games.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Otherwise, they're going to just keep designing the same game over and over and over.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you want to tell us before we wrap this up?
I think that's it. I think this has been awesome. I will say this: it was awesome meeting you.
Oh,
so I've told you this before, but this is true. There's 2 podcasts. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to a lot of game podcasts. And so, of course, we've talked about Liz. Liz is like my best friend in the world, and I love her podcast. But there's 2 podcasts that I find, I don't know how to describe it. It's like listening to my buddy talking, and it's just so awesome to live vicariously through you guys. And it's you and Mark Johnson, right, with your podcast.
War Games to Go.
Right.
Mark's fantastic.
Yeah. And you play games that I'll never play in my life. I don't even necessarily want to play them, right? So like ASL, take ASL. I don't really want to play it, but I love listening to other people talk about playing it. Right. It's really interesting. And so, I adore it, and I'm super excited every time you come out with a new podcast. So, now, this is a lost one for me. I don't want to listen to myself talk.
Well, I'll try to add some commentary about a game that you might never play, and I'll tag that on as part of this episode. I appreciate those comments. I feel the same way when I'm listening to Mark. Yeah. Like, he plays smaller games than I'll ever play.
Right.
But I so love listening to him describe whatever it is he got out of them, and that he's very good about talking about the history that he was intrigued by. So I totally get the allure of listening to people talk about games, even if they're not the games you're going to play.
Right. Yep. But meeting you here was one of the highlights. So it was
back
great.
at you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
There we go. Great guy. Easily one of the nicest men I've met in the hobby, and seems to be everywhere, co-designing with a dozen people at a time. I keep an eye out for anything he's working on. It's always fresh and a little outside what I'm used to. Bouquets. Well, this month I take my hat off to Tor and the gang at Rally the Troops. If you haven't been there, it's a website that has a few war games that you can play either in real time or asynchronously with opponents from around the globe, anybody else who's a member of Rally the Troops. And unlike Vassal or Tabletop Simulator or the like, it enforces the rules. So it's a big step up in many ways. And it just keeps getting better and better. They're adding new games all the time. They're up to 18 games now. And I've heard now somebody dropped by the Discord server the other day to let me know about a game that was about to be released. And apparently Tor has other folks working with them and coding new game implementations as well. So perhaps that's why we're seeing a speed up in how fast games are being released on Rally the Troops. Anyway, it's a great website with beautiful working games. Stop by if you haven't yet. It's really a wonder. Parting shots. Facebook generally stinks these days. That's not really a headline, is it? The level of discourse has gotten low, and moderators of the wargame groups often allow Nazi flags and name calling. So it's not my scene at all, really. I drop by to let folks know about things that are happening, but every time I get into a conversation there, somebody takes a dump on me or something happens, and it's just not my thing. But Facebook hit a real new low last week, and it had nothing to do with its users. Fort Circle Games has done a second print run of its excellent game Votes for Women. If you haven't seen it, it's a game about fighting for the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in the USA back in, 1919, 1920. Nothing controversial there, just a good old game about history. But when Fort Circle tried to run ads about it on Facebook promoting the game, they were flagged for being too controversial and liable to influence voting on current events. They appealed, presumably to get the ad looked at by a human rather than a bot, and they were still denied. So Facebook thinks talking about the history of women getting the vote is too woke to allow. Astonishing. We live in interesting times indeed. Anyway, thanks for listening. Please drop by our Discord server sometime and say hello. There's usually someone hanging around talking war games. And in the meantime, good luck gearing up for Valentine's Day. Get your sweetie a chocolate tank. See you next time.